I will start sharing my screen. Can folks see my screen?
Yeah, looks good.
All right. First up is I wanted to give like a last call for any showstopper issues with regards to the machine states and bootstrapping proposal. The goal from my perspective in moderating is that there's going to be a lot of nits where some people won't like things, and that's totally fair. And my comment is that we should rally on the nits for the next cycle. Right? Nothing perfect is the enemy of the good. And from what I see from this proposal, is it's a good incremental step. It doesn't solve everyone's problems, but I think it's trending in the right direction, and we can always revisit this again. My intention, or my thoughts at least from leading this group, will be that we will iterate as many times as needed in the alpha cycle to get folks into a state that they feel comfortable with before we go to beta. That seems like a reasonable approach that will allow us to have a long tail. And I want to reiterate that it's alpha. If people are doing production grade things on alpha-based technologies, I highly recommend that you wrap your implementation to support churn or modifications that could occur. So again, this should be like the last call. I think timeout by next week seems like a total reasonable time. There's been 3 weeks time frame on this, well, plus the eons of time we've had beforehand. I'm looking for showstoppers in particular, so if you have comments, please add them. I also wanted to give a brief shout out to constructive feedback and criticism. So one of the things that this group has kind of languished or had issues with is people have lots of comments, and which is good, but giving constructive feedback is even better, right? So, and recognizing that even though you might feel strongly about an idea, that it's okay to implement and go on with the current incantation and revisit the next iteration. So I want to give a shout out to Doug, Jan, and David in particular for their constructive feedback and how they've been recognizing that it's a stepwise function, and we're going to make more steps along the way. Vince, did you want to outline some of the breakdown of the work items that you currently have?
Yeah, we kind of like found like high level work items and like issues, and I tried to capture as much as I could, like in terms of like individual items. We can break this down even further, like once we go into the implementation. At a high level, like we have changes at the API types, so we need to introduce a V1 Alpha 2, and then work to kind of like change the controllers, so the machine controller, the machine set controller, and machine deployment. The machine controller is the one that will probably have the most changes, given the fact that we're kind of removing the actuator and the provider spec from it. And we also have a few deprecations. For example, machine class is not going to show up in V1 Alpha 2 for now. The node controller is going to be outdated, and mostly because it doesn't work in a management cluster. And there is the node ref controller, which will be backported to V1 Alpha 1, which will solve this issue. And then there's provider.deployer, which has been deprecated for a while in comments in the code, which hopefully we can remove within this iteration. And this gets us closer to having a generic cluster cuddle, which is a different topic. Last but not least, we have the kubeADM bootstrapper. I opened this issue, and I think we probably should discuss like where the code should go. I'm in favor of keeping things in tree for now, and then we can move them out later if like there is a need to.
So for the kubeADM bootstrapper, I do have concerns with keeping that one in tree, especially if we end up vendoring in the types. Keeping it out of tree would allow us to have different branches related to the different kubeADM types, and it would disconnect the release process of those from the main cluster API release process.
I'm not terribly concerned given the fact that we just released V1 Beta 2, and in conversation today, we have no intention whatsoever to change types for at least several cycles, because there's no intent. So the types are pretty low churn across versions at this point.
Well, if we do that, that would lock us into only supporting version 1.15 plus clusters then, wouldn't it, Tim?
Well, eventually you get into this support cycle for Kubernetes proper. So V1 Alpha 2 would be, it depends what you want to support, right? And what the community wants to support. If you did V1 Beta 2, you would be supporting 115, 116, and 117 most likely in the future for this iteration.
For me, I think ideally we'd want to support at a minimum the current supported Kubernetes versions, which at this point would be, what is it, 113, 114, and 115?
I'm just going to add, like, if we want to keep this code out of tree, I'm also okay with that. Like, so flexibility is like first thing, but I would kind of just like get things in motion to create a repo and like all the fancy things that we have to do.
Yeah, so there's going to be a cost associated either way, right? One cost is the dep graph, and the other cost is the vendor idososis. But if it's highly contained binary artifact that is does not require any reverse dependencies, then and you have a strict clean dependency graph, then that's even better, in my opinion.
We can do some investigation and come back to this topic. There is also controller runtime that needs to be upgraded, and which comes with its own Kubernetes lock in the lock file, so dependency. So maybe me, Jason, and other folks that are interested, we can discuss and make a final suggestion after today.
What's Spellegrino? You had a comment?
Yes, Pellegrino. I have a slightly different topic. I don't want to interrupt the discussion if there's more to be had on this.
Oh, if you have a different topic, feel free to add to the agenda at the end.
Well, I wanted to ask about how the providers are going to be picking up these new types. If there was a rough sketch for that. I can have that at the end.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Like, so I understand how the work that's going to happen in Kappa, CAPE, but then Kappa will presumably have issues filed at some point and will have some work to be done. And I'm just curious, in your mind, what time frame that looks like and how that's going to go.
That's a good question. So like it all kind of like depends on like where the first iteration of the machine controller actually gets published, because that's the first thing that we can actually test in an infrastructure provider. I would assume that like some of these pieces actually can probably work in parallel, but until we actually finalize the first spec or draft of the APIs for V1 Alpha 2, I don't think we can start working on the infrastructure provider yet.
Andy?
Thanks. There's going to be a period of time where master is broken, most likely between Cluster API proper and the various infrastructure providers, given that you have to modify Cluster API first, get those changes merged, and then you can go over to Kappa and the others. So it's going to be a process, and hopefully everybody can be patient and we'll figure it out as we go along.
Jason?
Yeah, I would say that one of the deliverables that we should have as part of the V1 Alpha 2 work should be documentation that can be consumed by the downstream providers for what it takes to go from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2.
Absolutely. If we don't actually have that in the backlog, can somebody take that as an action item to create that?
I'll add it to every issue that I open.
Any other questions with regards to the current proposal and the breakdown of work items?
So just to clarify, we have an action item with to just decide where the kubeadm code should go. Is that correct?
There's two parts. One is where the kubeadm code should go, and the other action item was to file an issue with documentation on how providers can absorb the changes for V1 Alpha 2 or go from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2.
Okay, so sounds good. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns with regards to the breakdown and the current last call for showstoppers? Going once, twice, 3 times. All right. Next up, PSA for final grooming this Friday. So currently on the call, we have, I don't know, what's the total count here? I lost track. We have 34 participants. The actual participant count for those who have been going through grooming has been much smaller. So the purpose of grooming is to get the work items that we want to try to address in V1 Alpha 2 in particular, kind of assigned out and divvied out across the people who are going to be executing within this subproject. If you have interest in wanting to help influence or wanting to help change the project over time, I highly recommend going to the grooming sessions. I will send out a public invite. And for those of you who haven't noticed, there's been a couple of calendar issues. I'm going to make sure that when I send out my invite, I get confirmation from multiple parties again, because apparently Google Calendar went through and ate itself yesterday. So some people didn't get the updated invite for the code walkthrough. And just for another PSA, is the code walkthrough is next week, Tuesday. Is that correct, Vince?
Yeah, and noon PST.
Okay. And above the notes, the general notes, is a listing of sort of some of the high level ideas that we want to go through with the code walkthrough. If you have recommendations or things you want to see or know about, please add that to that list, and we'll try to get that addressed too as well as part of the code walkthrough.
Just one comment on the scheduling of the grooming session. So Friday morning US time works out to be Friday evening for the rest of the world. So if future grooming sessions could be done not on a Friday morning, we might get, well, I know I would probably be able to attend, and maybe other people would prefer not to spend their Friday evening on a call. So I know it's a tough one, but it's just something I want to put out there.
That's a totally fair statement. My apologies. The problem currently is trying to find a time with these group of people has actually been very challenging. But I think we've been recording them and posting them, but one of the things too as well is even if you can't attend grooming, we do mark a bunch of issues as help wanted. And there's standard operating procedure, which is actually documented for SIG cluster lifecycle, which says just because a person has been defaultly assigned to something doesn't mean that they're the only person that can work on it. If you want to work on it, just say, raise your hand on the issue, or if it affects you and you're very interested in it. And you can do this in an asynchronous fashion. So I will put a link to the protocol that we typically follow. It is well documented, and it's worked across the SIG for several cycles. And that way you can asynchronously chime in on issues that you want to work on and coordinate with the default assignee asynchronously as well via Slack or whatever other means that is easiest for you.
Cool, that works as well.
Right. Any other questions with regards to grooming or code walkthrough? Going once, twice, 3 times. All right. Next up, I want to do a PSA with a proposal that came in from ACE, I believe. I have not personally had enough time to read it. So it is a pretty well-crafted proposal from first blush. So I think the ask is for both maintainers as well as the Peanut Gallery, which is a very large peanut gallery, to take a look at that proposal. And maybe Ace, if you are around next week, we can address any questions, comments, complaints, concerns at that time.
Okay, I'm actually going to be out of office next week, but maybe I can make either Friday next week, or sorry, I can make either next week work, or if not, the week after. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of start a discussion about this because I think it's an important topic.
Okay. That seems fair. Any questions or comments with regards to the current proposal? And once, twice, 3 times. All right. Well, we'll have a more in-depth discussion. Please review the proposal, and we'll take a look at it and talk about it. I wanted to give a PSA with regards to ClusterCuddle, the friendly tool we all seem to both love and despise. My intent is to kind of rally all the issues and backlog and come up with a sort of more comprehensive, cleaner story on ClusterCuddle, possibly within the V1 Alpha 2 timeframe, but at least to have it well documented with what we want to do, or to have a roadmap for ClusterCuddle that is sane. Currently, it's been it's very thorny, and there's a lot of legacy issues. So if you are interested in this work, please let me know, or please chime in on the issues. There's a label that we use called Area ClusterCuddle, and I'm happy to coordinate that effort with anyone else who wants to, who's a glutton for punishment and wants to jump on this grenade with me.
I could be a glutton for punishment on that one.
Okay.
So the only question that I have is, where do we kind of coordinate all of the feedback issues and wish lists? Is that something that you're going to be doing, or are we going to
I'm going to try and put them into bins or buckets, and then try to create one umbrella issue, which kind of outlines all the bins and buckets and how a potential approach to change things given the change that's coming in V1 Alpha 2. So I'll try to create an umbrella issue that kind of summarizes all these things together, but it's going to be there's going to be a huge number of issues associated with that umbrella.
Cool.
All right. Any questions, comments, complaints, concerns with ClusterCuddle? Once, twice, 3 times. So Chuck had requested us to make a final call with regards to a question we had in the CAPI repo, which is related to a kind deployer as a default test deployer inside of the main CAPI repo. The purpose, in my mind, would be to turnkey modify in any API modifications would have a turnkey example test deployer that would have to also be modified in order for us to make changes. And it would also serve as a reference example, in my opinion, for any downstream providers. There's a long topic of conversation, so maybe I'll pause and let Jason say his points, and then I'll say my points, and then folks can say in or out. Want to go, Jason?
Yep. So my biggest concern is, and if we do this post as part of the V1 Alpha 2 work, I think some of my concerns go out the window. My biggest concern around doing it with the current state of things is that the Bootstrap provisioning is tied very heavily with the infrastructure provisioning today, and that would cause us potential concerns with which versions of the kubeadm types we're vendoring versus the controller runtime dependencies that we're pulling in.
I think because it's localized to a kind deployer, and the vendoring, unless somebody else picks up that particular provider, would be a non-issue because it'd be localized to that specific deployer, that specific provider. I'm sorry, my vernacular is getting lost here. So vendoring from the main CAPI repo wouldn't affect anyone unless they vendored in a crazy pants fashion the provider specific stuff that's underneath there.
Oh, I meant the actual conflicts and dependencies vendoring both the kubeadm types and the Kubernetes versions that we're pulling in through controller runtime.
That is a fair statement. I'd have to actually dig into what exists there. KubeADM types themselves should not vendor anything from KK. And if people are doing that, there's a potential conflict of them vendoring internal types versus the external types. So perhaps this is a non-issue, because in last inspection with Lubomir and myself, we had noticed that you should not be pulling in any specific type information from K proper, so they should not conflict at all, unless there's some actual weird dependency that's occurring.
So, well, if we manually recreated the types, I would agree. But like currently for the AWS provider, we just import them from KK today, and that would potentially cause a conflict with.
Again, I think you're probably importing the wrong location. If you import the specific external types versus the internal types, this should not be an issue.
Right, but you can only vendor one version of the Kubernetes repo, and that's either the version that's pulled in through transitive dependencies through controller runtime, or the one pulled in through the KubeADM types.
Yeah, that's a fair thing. So the controller runtime, I don't know what the current version of KubeBuilder is up to speed on, but we can evaluate that. Andy and Vince have their hands raised. So why doesn't we let Andy go first and Vince second?
I think we may want to consider that we stop vendoring KubeADM types or other API types from a given repo and instead think about copy and paste and maintaining it ourselves so that we can have multiple versions, V1 beta 1, V1 beta 2, and so on, without worrying about having to stick to what controller runtime forces us to import, just as a possibility.
That's a reasonable approach too. Vince, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, first I wanted to echo Chuck that in the chat, like express the interest of like having external as well. And I would say like I'm also leaning towards external. And given that like if we're trying to copy the types as well, like, and this is kind of like also goes back to like where do we put the KubeADM bootstrapper? If we put it in another repo, then the types might also be in another repo. That makes sense, and it will like reduce the depth story. And given that we had like a lot of issues with that and vending. Okay.
Yeah, I think my biggest concern, and which has been a consistent concern with this project, which is why I kind of want an entry, is for speed. The turnkey time for being able to detect modifications to the API and detecting their breakage across a given provider. So that way when providers have a guarantee or signal eventually from the main CAPI repo that they have a reference example that is always consistent or functional. But I'm not the one who's going to be doing most of this work. So I think it's fair if the other people push back on me and say we want it out, then that's fine too.
So I agree that's a nice to have, but I think that like it will be a short-term gain instead of a long-term one, given that like fixing like dependency issues has been like an ongoing thing, especially in the providers right now, especially in the AWS provider when we update controller runtime and then we have to override the Kubernetes dependencies. So
yeah, I think the depth graph problem is for real.
Yep.
So it sounds to me I'm being outvoted, which is totally fair. I haven't heard anyone besides me say +1. So I think you have your answer, Chuck. Okay. Next up, Cluster API contributor t-shirts. Jason.
Yes, I've got approval to go ahead and do another batch of contributor t-shirts for Cluster API. If you haven't already seen them, I linked into the Cluster API logos that are in Tree. The design's basically going to be based on those. And I want to limit anybody signing up to people that haven't already received the Cluster API t-shirt. And I will be deduping the list against the previous list as well. So I do not have a field for address in the sign up spreadsheet because I figured most people will not want to publish their personal mailing address on a public spreadsheet. So please reach out to me privately to give me your address so that we can make sure to get t-shirts to you. Thank you. You're muted, Tim.
I added that. I just saw like a lot of new people joined the meeting, and I just wanted to give a welcome everyone. And please feel free to always like add questions, comments, concerns to the agenda.
With that lead in, are there any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns that folks wanted to discuss with the group? Going once, twice, 3 times. Okay, I think we can give people 30 minutes of their time back, which is great. One of the things I wanted to remind folks of is after the backlog is groomed and the issues are in place, as well as the proposal is merged, we will go into go-go mode. So we'll be doing continuous grooming as part of this call. So if you have new issues, please log them away as part of regular execution. We'll try to triage them as we are in execution mode. As always, feel free to open up issues at any moment in time, but we'll try to be more aggressive with making sure that we address them in a timely fashion. Okay, have a great week. Take care, everybody.